I don't want to be like grim about it, but yeah, it's a bad it's a bad conflict that will probably be kind of prolonged, and there's no good solution to it. Like the end of it, it's either way, either side wants people to be dislocated and moved. So it's like, well, it doesn't work out very well. And then of course, all the holy sites that are there in Israel for both Christians and Muslims and Jews, all Um, so the kind of international world culture significance of this very small strip of land is hard to be rivaled probably anywhere else in the world. So I mean, we're not going to spend more time tonight talking about that, but I am going to host a discussion night on uh, whatever next Monday is. I don't know what date that is. I'll send out a little blurb or a flyer or something like that. But to just talk about this and look at like everything from like the ancient history to the modern period, of the region, um, and also then kind of getting into the international geopolitics of the situation and countries aligned with which sides and how we got to this crazy situation in the first place. So I'm like I feel well equipped enough to do that. Maybe an hour or two of prep. But I'm going to invite. I haven't messaged him yet, but I'm going to message John Vento tonight to see if he'd come co do that with me. So because he can speak volumes more on the geopolitical situation than I can. So hopefully he is not teaching a class on Monday night and would want to do it. So I'm thinking 7 to 10. And I did a bunch of these pre-pandemic. I do these pretty frequently, especially in the nicer months. But I haven't hosted anything like this in a few years. But I've got a big backyard and a fire pit, and we'll just kind of circle up around it and talk and listen and hang out. And yeah, I was gonna do one. I've been trying to sketch one out to do on the Barbie movie and like what it means to be human. But then this happened, and I'm like, wow, this seems like a much more significant and pressing thing to gather and talk and think about, because it's like a big part of our world now, and it will be a thing that defines this this moment. One of the things I find that is helpful in studying history for us in the present is, yeah, to like recognize mistakes and try to avoid repeating things, sure. But I think equally as important is recognizing the things that define the time, and and then being able to kind of recognize the things that are going to define whatever moment we're living in. I feel like the older you get, the easier that is to do because you've lived more years. So, when you're 20, that you got a couple decades under your belt and you don't remember a lot of them, you weren't paying attention to any of this stuff, right? And just now it's like, okay, starting to wrap my mind around things like Israel, Palestine, or the situation in Ukraine, or just our own political like moment where we're at as politically divided states and a country that is way further apart and uncooperative with each other than has been in decades and decades and decades. So Trump will certainly define the era that he kind of kicked off in 2015 through I don't know how long. Like nobody does. It hasn't been written, but he set things in motion that are playing out long after he's been out of power. and like reshape the political landscape in America. And so if Trump's not around, Trumpism is definitely around. So it's like that's going to be the backdrop for 2015 to whatever, because that I think that marks such a significant uh, turn in kind of American history that there's no way that is overshadowed by events that preceded it for sure. So just like in 1929, when Wall Street, plummets and people lose their shirts in the stock market, and not just the stock market, but the housing market, right? Agricultural prices, industrial goods being sold, consumer goods being sold, like all of those things. It was a cascading effect for everything. And so banks closed, and it's not like today. If a bank closes today, like, a local savings and loan, they go out of business, your money is guaranteed by the federal government, up to, I think it's like $250,000. In 1929, though, when banks closed, and like 1932, I think was the highest, 5,000 banks closed in America. Your money's just gone. So that's why, like, old-timey Depression era people, like my grandparents were that. They were probably like teens and 20s in the 30s. Um, you keep your money as cash in the freezer or in your mattress or something like that. It's like they don't trust banks at all. Even though a few years after this, when Franklin Roosevelt is elected president, he puts in all these safety nets and guardrails to prevent stuff like this happening again. And one of them is the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So this is all real banks that are, commercial banks for people like you and me to put money in. They're like FDIC approved. This is why, if you've ever wondered why you can't buy your weed from a weed store with like a card or Venmo or Tap Pay or anything like that, it's because that money goes into a bank account, and they can't have them because under like federal law, a bunch of there's just a bunch of laws relating to marijuana that would make doing business with banks that are holding that money illegal. The same way it's like, oh, if you were like manufacturing ghost guns, you can't have a bank account, that's for sure. Like the government is not going to be able to do that and dance with you and your illicit cash. So yeah, the crash of Wall Street, it marks America straight up to the entry of World War II, which is another like significant milestone event. So, if you've noticed in the book, right, I have sometimes it's very obvious where the like year marker should be for ending a chapter and beginning a new one. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to nail down. But like in the cases of the wars starting, that's a pretty start and end dates for like these huge epic wars that envelop the whole world. That's a pretty self-contained, idea and moment in history, era, whatever. And if America hadn't entered World War II, what would have been the event that we're like, oh, okay, here's kind of the end of the Depression, New Deal era, and the beginning of whatever follows after that. And it's really impossible to say because even if we wanted to pick a technology that's, revolutionary, like the jets or the television, or the solid state transistor, like, okay, those are like things that will totally change the world, but when's the date we pick for that? Like television, people were inventing TVs in the 20s. They had televisions during World War II. They just weren't like in America, they weren't commercially sold or available. Just kind of like radio existed during World War One, but nobody was using it commercially. It was like hobbyists. So both of those wars, though, significantly improved the technology that those technologies use and are reliant on, to where they're better and cheaper and like ready to roll after the war is over. So it's like, wow, who knows if the 50s would have been so marked by TV, or like the 50s and 60s so marked by space travel. If we weren't in World War II, we wouldn't have microwaves if it weren't for World War II. A radar technician was doing testing equipment with these new like huge vacuum tubes, like this big, and he noticed that like after he was running the tests, he's right by the radar machine, the chocolate in his pocket had melted. And so he thought, I wonder if like wave emissions from this technology could be used to heat food quickly. So then he tried it with a kernel of corn and it popped, like, okay, microwave popcorn. There you go. And so then he calls one of his colleagues over and he's like, look, this is working to cook food. And so he puts an egg, cracks an egg and goes to fry it, and it just explodes all over them because it was way too high of, wattage for the microwave transmissions. But it was a total accident, and it was straight out of World War II, like a very direct link. There's so many technologies like that. The computer, right? Everything that all of our computers and cell phones, all of that, the basic like language and you know processing of information is the same that Alan Turing and the team developed during World War II to crack the Enigma machine, the German like coding machine, and we did, and it worked, and it birthed modern computers. So this like it's hard to understate the the shift that wars have on society, because it's not just death and death tolls and stuff like that. It's also all the things that come out that shape a new society after the war is over and the building or rebuilding begins. In the in the 20s, that's also very true, right? And it's why, like I was saying, the 20s and the uh, uh, 50s, they share a lot of similar things. The 60s and the 30s, yes and no. In both of those decades, there is a greater sense of social togetherness. So in the 30s, it's from the Depression. And this is, so not only was the FDIC one of those things that comes out of the Depression and the New Deal, but other things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, workers' compensation, and unemployment insurance, those things all come out of this decade, which means they didn't exist when the Depression happened. So there is no unemployment insurance from the government. There's no Social Security benefits for old people that are getting like trying to find food out of trash cans, right? There's no workers' comp. If you get hurt, you're just screwed. Which, a few weeks back when we were talking about the progressives and I was mentioning the jungle, that's one of the things you see really clearly in that the industrial world it's dangerous. People are getting hurt all the time working. But then when they get hurt, and like hurt could be getting your arm or leg ripped off, you're just unemployed. You're just fired because you're no longer useful to the company. So it's a very, kind of cruel and brutal world. which wasn't different from the world before. I mean, I think the world has been brutal and increasingly, becoming more civil. It's not a straight line. There's waves, but um, the all the things that make the depression so bad, like not having any of these social safety nets, are things that the progressives were on about 30, 40 years before this, and campaigning for. So it takes a long time to implement these changes. So think about that when, because this is one type of problem. Another type of problem, and this is probably where the 30s and 60s differ a lot. There, there wasn't great progress made for racial uh, inclusion and the end of segregation. Where in the 60s, that was one of the things that people were rallying around. Where in the 30s, they're rallying around general poverty, and we have to take care of our neighbors, and we can all get through this if we pull together and help other people. So both decades were very. I feel like people in those decades looked both outward and inward a lot more than people in the preceding decades did in the 20s and 50s. They're searching themselves because times are hard and people are tested during times like that. But then they're also very actively looking outward at everybody else and their neighbors and their neighborhood and their towns and cities that they live in. And then both were like very progressive decades in terms of getting a lot of change, new legislation passed and led by Democrat through both decades. I'm going to play this because it's just great. It's old Bernie Sanders. I mean, he's kind of always been old. He's like Johnny Cash. I'm like, oh, you look like you came out of the womb with a like cigarette in your hand. Like, he's talking about the bailouts for banks that we have done from time to time. And the argument is in the 1929 in the early 30s, banks were failing at great rate, and the federal government wasn't stepping in to save them, and it created ripple waves through all those other areas and sectors of the country, and then the world too. And like we looked at last week, the Great Depression starts before 1929 and the collapse of Wall Street in other places around the world. So Germany is going through this early, as does Austria. They're in the 20s. And then that sends, ripples into France and Britain, and into America, who were expecting payments from war loans and stuff like that. So it's starting earlier, and the banks are failing, but having banks fail and just go under is people are realizing in a modern economy that is not a way to course correct things. So conventional wisdom said in a depression, cut budgets, tighten the belt, cut jobs, do all these things, which in a simpler world, that works. So, think of your own personal budget, right? If you're like, okay, you're a student and you've got like a few bills and you need X amount for gas and food and whatever. And you've got a limited amount of income from a job. Okay, so if all of a sudden things are more expensive for you and you get less money from your job, and okay, tighten the belt, like that works. That will help you squeeze through and not go into the red. Or if you go into the red, you cut more things so you can pay down your credit card. That's like pretty basic personal finance stuff. And that's how people thought about government. And, in 1776, the federal government was pretty small. Even up to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln every Friday would sit out on the front lawn of the White House in a rocking chair and just hold court. Like anybody could go talk to him and talk about a problem or ask for him to intervene in something. And he'd sit there and listen to people. Like if you went when, like, John Adams was president, he might open the door of the White House if you knocked on it. He might be the one opening the door. It's like the federal government's very small. So, and the economy is much more simple in 1776, right? Way simpler than in the 1920s. So that doesn't work. That's an old, outdated idea. And so saving banks and people's money that is in those banks and having greater banking regulations is something that makes sense. Now, also being able to control the money supply would help be able for the federal government to regulate the economy. So this is where the Federal Reserve comes in. And the Federal Reserve, it's created in 1912, I think, under Woodrow Wilson. It is a weird thing. It is not part of the government. It's owned by like the top bankers and banks in the nation, and they have an exclusive monopoly to print money for America. So if you look at, like cash, it will say a federal deposit a Federal Reserve note. Like it's not, and for a while those were backed by gold, but that changes here in the 30s as well, I believe. And in terms of like a consumer society where so much of our economy depends on people buying things, particularly things we don't need, right? Not necessarily cars. Those are consumer goods, but they're also like a transportation necessity in most of the places that Americans are living. But televisions are not, even though they feel like they are, right? An Apple Watch is not a necessity, right? But boy, if everybody stopped buying those instantly, like, I mean, Apple would be fine. They're like the most valuable company in the world. They're probably a bad example to use, but other manufacturers that are a lot smaller, they're gonna go belly up. They don't have months or years of reserve to rely on. It's the small ones, and so one of the things we'll see happen through this kind of transition from one economy into another is the federal government will come in under Franklin Roosevelt when he gets elected in 1932. They will come in and intervene. They'll interfere with what companies are doing. So what they're allowed to make, right? So automobile manufacturers, they're gonna not say, hey, this is how much you're allowed to produce, but they'll say, you guys, and they'll say this to the auto manufacturing industry, but the big three, or it was maybe more like five or six, in 1933, they say, you guys set your own quotas so you're not overproducing stuff and work it out amongst yourselves, which of course is dominated by the big firms. The little manufacturers, their voice doesn't matter like at all in that. And so before the Great Depression, I don't know, you had like 40 or 50 different car manufacturing companies in America. And after, by the time you get done with the Depression and out of the war, it's 3. We see a gobbling up of smaller firms into kind of these big huge gigantic corporations. And it doesn't just happen in, auto manufacturing. It happens in farming. It happens in the entertainment industry. It happens with banks, because uh, the ones that are able to crawl out of the water quicker can gobble up the ones that are struggling. So the idea was behind making the Federal Reserve was to give the federal government some degree of control over the money supply and how much money was in circulation and what interest rates would be, because they're the ones that lend money to the banks. So you gotta love this. The bankers own the Federal Reserve, and they're the ones that lend themselves money from the Federal Reserve, of which they print and control it. It is like the most rigged system in the world. It's it's shocking that people aren't more upset about it. I think it's hard to understand, though. That's why it's confusing. I think it's confusing on purpose to, like, obfuscate the kind of source of money and how it works and where it comes from and who's getting rich off of it and controlling how it works. And the the mission of this was to prevent future depressions by controlling inflation, by controlling interest rates that they're lending money to banks to tighten up the money supply, have less of it available because you're making interest rates higher. So other people and businesses are less likely to borrow money, which means there's just less of it flowing around. That's what you're supposed to do when inflation happens. So that's why, if you've seen in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, inflation's gone through the roof, but so have interest rates, right? Like, I bought my first house in 2009, right after the housing market crash, and I think I had like a 2% interest on my house. It was crazy. It was crazy small. Now it's like, I don't know, 10%. It's wild. So a bunch of people, our critics, look at this and say, you guys made this thing so there'd never be another depression, because there had been bad depressions in America just like this before. This one exceeds the previous bad ones. I think the probably the worst one was in 1907. And this is worse than that because America's economy is even more interconnected with the rest of the world, and it's more diverse, and it's more complex. And so the systems that crumble, they crumble like completely. Before I play the Sanders clip, I'll have a screen share too. Let me find a video on the Federal Reserve that really too.
The new best way to make money online that nobody's talking about is something you've never heard before. It's using remote automation. So these right here are real paychecks that I've received every month for the past 2 years from just one of the businesses I've helped with copy and paste automations.
The Federal Reserve, the cornerstone of the.
Okay, so I haven't watched this one. I have I have one that I've typically shown that I might pull up after this, but yeah, here we go.
American economy. For just over a century, the Fed has overseen the financial system of the US, but its track record has been far from perfect. Worse yet, it has such a unique and convoluted structure that it's very difficult for people to really understand it, which is why, unsurprisingly, the Fed has been subject to various conspiracy theories, from being owned by the Rothschilds to being operated by lizard people. Today, we're going back to the dawn of American finance to see how the Fed was created, how it works, and who really owns it. This video is brought to you by Skillshare, where you can find a ton of different classes, including my own series of videos on how the stock market works. You can watch them for free by registering with the link in the description. America during the late 19th century was a nation in turmoil, and not just in the literal sense. The Civil War was no doubt devastating, but even during the peace that followed, America was plagued by frequent and deep economic depressions. The underlying cause was simple. America just lacked a proper financial system, and more importantly, it didn't have a central bank to save the day when things turned bad. Now keep in mind, central banking wasn't a new concept. The Dutch were the first to come up with a central bank in 1609, and it was instrumental in transforming the Netherlands from a swampy backwater into a global economic empire. Following the example of the Dutch, the English created the Bank of England in 1694, which of course became the backbone of the British Empire. But it's exactly this association with the British that made the Founding Fathers reluctant to use the same model in the United States. There were two attempts at establishing a central bank even despite public opposition. Alexander Hamilton himself led the first movement in 1791. But in both cases the systems lasted under 20 years and did little to stabilize the situation. And by all accounts the situation was very, very bad. Back then, even a single local bank failing could result in nationwide panics. People knew that no one could save their bank if it went bust, so as soon as rumors of insolvency started spreading, everyone frantically started withdrawing whatever they had, bankrupting otherwise healthy and solvent banks simply out of fear. Such bank runs happened with frightening regularity, and the depressions that followed were long and painful. Of course, American bankers realized very well just how bad their industry was doing. Paul Warburg, one of the great American bankers of his day, said in 1907 that the American banking system then was at about the same point as 15th century Italy or Babylon in 2000 BC. Just a few months after Warburg made that statement, the country suffered the Panic of 1907, and it was particularly severe. To start things off, in 1906 a devastating earthquake destroyed 80% of San Francisco. With reconstruction efforts underway, capital was very tight, and because all the money back then was in paper form, it was much more difficult to reallocate it across the country. One banker tried to abuse that by manipulating the stock price of the United Copper Company back on Wall Street. He hoped to see the shares rise exponentially in value, but instead they crashed, dragging down the entire stock market with them. That banker was involved in 10 different banks across the East Coast, and one after another, these banks failed as people assumed they were insolvent and withdrew all their money. Pretty soon, even banks that had nothing to do with the guy were going under, and so the fearful bankers of America turned to the only man with the power to save them, J.P. Morgan. Back then, John Morgan was the king of Wall Street, and even today the bank he created is the largest one in America. He wasn't the wealthiest man at the time, that title belonged to John Rockefeller, but Morgan was certainly the man everyone turned to when things got bad. In October 1907, Morgan summoned the great bankers of the day to his office at 23 Wall Street. With the collective capital of America's big banks, Morgan arranged for the rescue of the healthy banks that were nevertheless near bankruptcy due to irrational fears. Virtually the same thing would happen a century later in 2008, when the government bailed out the banks, but this time it was happening entirely thanks to private individuals like John Morgan. Once the panic was contained, it became clear to everyone that a central bank was necessary, and Congress immediately passed legislation to create one. However, that was pretty much the only thing everyone agreed on. The actual details of how it would work sparked long and fierce debates that halted any progress. The agricultural South, for example, was afraid that a powerful central bank would give Washington and Wall Street too much power over them. The bankers, meanwhile, wanted to make sure that the central bank would not be manipulated by political interests. They wanted it to be as independent as possible from Washington. The sheer number of competing parties made creating a central bank extremely difficult, and negotiations would in fact take over 5 years to finalize. What's interesting, though, is that these negotiations weren't happening on Capitol Hill. Instead, they were held 600 miles south of Washington on Jekyll Island in Georgia. That resort was home to an exclusive club of over 100 of the wealthiest men at the time, including John Morgan. Of course, only a select few would help draft the actual plan for the central bank, and it wouldn't be until 1913 that legislation would actually come to pass. The newly created Federal Reserve was truly a miracle of compromise. To accommodate all the various interests of the diverse United States, the Fed became a central bank unlike any other in the world. To begin with, it wasn't a single bank. Instead, it was a network of 12 regional banks, each governed by local bankers and businessmen. Some of these banks were in obvious places, like New York and Chicago, but many of the other locations came down to politics. The senator from Missouri, for example, was a key vote needed to pass legislation, which is why today Missouri is the only state to have 2 Federal Reserve banks within its borders. To appease Washington, these 12 regional banks would have a single governing body, comprised of 7 people appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. To limit the president's power, he can only appoint 1 governor every 2 years with a 14-year term. But the really unique part of the Fed's structure, and you can thank John Morgan for that, is the fact that each regional bank is actually structured as a private corporation that has its own stock. Here's how it works. Every nationally chartered bank in America is required by law to keep 6% of its capital in its regional reserve bank. In exchange, that private bank receives an equivalent amount of shares in the regional reserve bank. These shares, however, are quite different from the shares of public companies. Their price is fixed at $100 per share, and they can't be sold or traded. They carry voting rights to about 2/3 of the board of directors for that regional reserve bank, but as we know, the real power is in the board of governors appointed by the president. What these shares do have, however, is a fixed 6% dividend per year. Now, it's worth noting that this dividend doesn't entitle the banks to any of the Fed's profits. Instead, everything the Fed earns above that 6% payout goes directly into the Treasury. And keep in mind, the Fed is very profitable. In 2017, it sent $80 billion to the Treasury, while only paying out $14 billion to the regular banks that hold its stock. So who are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve? Well, basically every big bank in America. The full list is 150 pages long, but pretty much every name you know appears on it. But here's the beautiful thing. Most of America's big banks are public corporations. In other words, if you want to benefit and make money off of the unique structure of the Federal Reserve, you can do that by purchasing stock in American banks. Since ownership in the Fed depends on capital, the bigger the bank, the bigger its ownership stake. Therefore, it would be wisest to start from the top of the list. And speaking of the stock market, in case you somehow missed it, last month I released a 20-minute animated series of videos on how the stock market works on Skillshare. I cover topics like how dividends get paid out or how ETFs work, and if you want to watch the full class, you can have different classes on Skillshare, and I'm thankful for those live, but until then, make sure you've checked out Skillshare.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't expect you guys to retain all of that information in one sitting, because it is like confusing and, you know, it's convoluted. You see, it's like, oh, this is like shell corporations almost. Like the banks are, you know, kind of the regional ones are like the shell for all these other ones that are actually operating and kind of self-dealing. So one of the ways that the banks get in trouble in the 20s, even though the Federal Reserve is in operation, is that, like many Americans in the 20s, they were playing the stock market, and a lot of speculative, basically gambling on stocks and like property portfolios. And so the housing market pops in 1926, I think, And that's one of those things in America that is sending the ripple wave that will crash Wall Street. And the banks that are owning these properties and stocks that are both going to just plummet and bottom out, they were buying these things and making investments with the deposits of like regular people like you and me and regular like local businesses. So you've got commercial banks like Bank of America, right? You know, banks that we use, local savings and loans banks, and you've got investment banks that'd be like, you know, well, it was Lehman Brothers, or yeah, I think there's a bajillion investment banks. They're like the big time stock traders is essentially how they work. And but so then when they lose on these, you know, less than sound investments, they lose the money of the regular people that invested it. So this is like adding to their collapse and their demise. So one of the safety nets that FDR puts in to provide against this is it's called the Glass-Steagall Act, and it bars commercial banks from being investment banks with their clients' money. And this works. It keeps the economy steadily growing for 40 years. And really, like, things dip in the 70s, but then they pick back up pretty quickly in the 80s. And you know, in the 70s, I'd say maybe you've got a little bit of a recession, not nearly as bad as the 2008 one. But then the Reagan years are growing and climbing, and then guess what? Conservatives get Congress to repeal this act. And then, you know, handful of years later, 2008 happens. It's like, well, you dummies, you knew this would happen. Like, this is exactly what you did last time. But the difference between going into the Great Depression and the Great Recession that we, you know, experienced 2008 and after, is that the federal government did bail out all the banks. They didn't let banks fail. They gave millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to bankers while regular people lost their homes and, you know, all of those things. So this is a great little short clip of Bernie Sanders telling the Senate that their heads are up their rear ends for thinking.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this bill. I support financial modernization if modernization means more choices for consumers, more competition, greater safety and soundness, stopping unfair bank fees, and protecting consumers and underserved communities. But, Madam Speaker, I believe this legislation in its current form will do more harm than good. It will lead to fewer banks and financial service providers, increased charges and fees for individual consumers and small businesses, diminished credit for rural America, and taxpayer exposure to potential losses should a financial conglomerate fail. It will lead to more mega mergers, a small number of corporations dominating the financial service industry, and further concentration of economic power in this country. It is no secret, Madam Speaker, that bigger financial institutions lead to bigger fees, which totaled more than $18 billion last year. The U.S. Public Interest Research Group and the Federal Reserve Bank have conducted studies and confirmed that bigger banks charge larger fees. And there is no question in my mind that if this bill is passed, that process will be accelerated. This bill is, in fact, however, good for big banks. But the big banks are doing just fine without this bill. Government-insured banks earned a record $18 billion in just the first 3 months of this year, $2.1 billion more than they earned in the same period last year. At a time of increasing bank fees, increasing ATM surcharges, increasing credit card fees, increasing minimum balance requirements, It is time for the Congress to stand up for the consumers. The big banks are doing fine. Let's protect the consumers. Let's vote no on this legislation.
Gentleman's time has
Even if you're not a fan of his politics, you got to respect that guy, he has been the same forever. Like, he doesn't flip-flop on issues at all. And I mean, literally everything he said, it came to pass. This is, let's see if I can find it. Is flowchart one word? Yeah, flowchart. So, okay. Here we go. So that happens in 1999. So it goes into effect. And in 2000, you can see look at this consolidation. And there's changes to banking law in like 1989 under Reagan Bush as well. So typically, conservative people are more in favor of deregulation and taking stipulations and regulations off of people and businesses. And to be fair, after they repealed this, Americans got richer. Like, between 2000 and 2007, 8, it was high on the hog for America. Like, consumerism like grew tremendously. Oh, but it doesn't last, and that's why they created the Federal Reserve in the first place, is because we have to be able to control the money and interest rates and all of this stuff, because in modern economies, what we started seeing in the 19th century was boom and bust cycles, just like that. Like, oh, it's really good. Oh my God, it's horrible. Oh, it's really good. Oh my God, it's like this is hurting people and creating misery. And so we see like very clear evidence of that, like right here. This deregulation, it led to a boom, but they're short-term gains. And honestly, that's really how most of corporate America works right now. Very few companies are positioning themselves or structuring themselves to just be, good companies, valuable companies years into the future. They're all like, they buy up corporations, usually that aren't even worth what they're paying for them, and strip them up and sell them, and it boosts profits for a quarter. And that's really all the like leadership of corporations care about, because in big Fortune 500 ones, if you're losing money, all the stockholders at the meeting, they'll vote you out of your position and you'll get fired. So you don't really have the luxury to think super long term about things and make mistakes and have down quarters and whatnot. Yeah, and this is, if we could take this and go to 1929, and there'd be something similar that led to these groups, but then also the same thing with the auto industry and, like I said, farming even. Farming is it's a very industrial thing these days. And that's just kind of how technology and progress moves, is that why do something for more money and more work when you can do it for less? And harnessing new technologies is good for humanity, because we can create a lot more food with less land and less people and labor than ever before. The problem is those corporations are also corporations, and they're greedy, and they've got CEOs and CFOs that have to have good quarters all the time. And anybody in here ever watch Food Inc? It's kind of old now. It's like 15 years old probably. I feel like it was one of the first of kind of what became, I think, a genre of like investigative journalism documentaries, where they go and do this deep dive into just the modern food industry in general. So it's not against like one company or even one industry. They go to like the Tyson chicken farm. They go to some of these places. You're like, this is not how we should be raising food. This is bad for us. Oh, rich people don't eat Tyson chicken. Like they're getting farm fresh, whatever. Like, oh, this is like wealth in inequity right here, in our food industry. And things like Monsanto. They're a huge corporation. They own tons of stuff, but they own like a good percentage of the farming in America. And one of their big crops is soybeans. And they made a soybean that's immune to a certain type of pesticide, and they patented that bean. Like, you can get patents on beans, it's a weird thing. And so then they started, planting that all over their farms, and all the farmers around them that didn't want to buy Monsanto seed and use their own, they were squeezed out of business because the farm right across the street is going to use their pesticide that kills all the other soybeans that don't have this genetic change in them. There's so many problems from that, but this is like, out of the ashes of the Great Depression. This is where we start to get like mega corporations, just like absolutely huge, too big to fail businesses, right? So, like we've been doing this for a very long time, conservatives and liberals. Instead of a bunch of people at GM getting laid off, I think GM employs like, I don't know, or at one point employed like 800,000 Americans, right? So if they went through this and they're gonna lay off a third of their force, or if they're gonna fail, why not just give GM money to keep people in work making American cars, rather than them all losing their jobs and getting unemployment insurance money straight to them? Which, I mean, there is a logic to that. I don't think that's actually necessarily a bad thing, but it is sure as hell not capitalism, right? Like, and that's a more typically, like, conservatives wind up doing more of that than liberals. But that's not capitalism at all. Capitalism, you're supposed to have things that fail. Otherwise, there's not going to be new businesses, right? If a tree doesn't fall in the forest, a new one's not going to grow up, and that's kind of like a very hard baked in idea to that is crazy to me. That yeah. Anyways, so with the world in crisis, particularly, the more advanced and complicated economies, so the modernized places of the world in 1920, America, most of the Western European states, the Soviet Union, Japan, a handful of places, they're in crisis because their societies are like collapsing, right? So Hitler, I think I mentioned this last week when we were talking about the 20s. He starts making a name for himself early in the 20s, I think 1922, when he's holding these like rallies to overthrow not the German government, because they knew that's too big, but it was the local government. Like, hey, let's go throw all the communists and socialists out the windows of City Hall and take over Munich. And so, he's like trying to incite insurrection in Munich, and he goes to jail for it, and that's where he writes Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and he lays out all the problems that Germany's facing, and all this like nationalistic, hero kind of the great Germany history. It's like folk history. It's like myth. It's all like this myth of how great Aryan people are, and the German people, are destined for supremacy because of our great history. It's not totally unlike some of the more, I feel like things are changing now, but certainly like American history textbooks in the 50s, like it's it's like a nationalistic myth, really, more as much as it is historical fact. Um, and so he writes this book. It's absolute dog shit. It is, like, I'm not just saying that because it's Hitler. Like, it's horribly written, and it's mostly like, it kind of feels like when you're talking to your crazy uncle who's like gone way too deep into conspiracy theories, and you're like, bro, you're jumping from topic to topic. Like, stay on point. This is, and it's not like a bestseller because it really isn't like well written. But it does gain a following. And, the Nazi party is growing in the 20s, as are a bunch of other like radical parties. In Italy, that's happening in the aftermath of the war. And with America's help, actually, Benito Mussolini rises to power as, Italy's leader. He invents fascism, which is like very rigidly state controlled things. And to a degree, it works. Italy's economy comes out of the slump of the war, and there's like law and order, and it's not so bad. Like, he's not the guy he turns into when he's like Hitler's best friend in the 40s. Kind of like Hitler in the early 30s. Like, oh, if he would have gotten assassinated or died, he'd have been remembered as like probably a great German politician. Same thing for Benito Mussolini. Instead, he winds up getting like chased down by a mob at the end of the war, and they hang him and his mistress butt ass nude from a pole at a gas station and leave them there for like days. I'm like, damn, man, those people hated you. Like, that's extreme. In the 20s, there's the Russian Revolution, but then there's a civil war between like the communists and the socialists, essentially, in Russia, for a handful of years, and I think that ends in like 1923, maybe, which is right around the time Lenin, the leader of the movement, dies. And he had various like lieutenants, and he basically told people like, hey, whoever takes over, any of you guys, that's cool. Not Stalin. Like, that guy, don't trust him. He is a psychopath. Like, there's something wrong with him. Which, of course, he winds up grabbing power through the kind of chaos of Lenin's death and the Civil War. And like, kind of like with Mussolini, taking total power and control over everything, laws, the economy, trade, you've got control over things. You're not really sharing with like a Congress or something like that, or Parliament. They're able to whip the Soviet Union into pretty quick shape. They start making, automobiles and airplanes. I think Ford went over there and trained a bunch of people and opened factories for them to make cars. Like, they are doing relatively well, but it's because they were under this like iron-fisted ruler who just had control and was able to say, no, we're going to do this for efficiency. So like Mussolini and then Hitler, and he'll get elected in 1933. He does the same thing. He doesn't have absolute power right away at all, but he does put in like some draconian laws and eliminates some things like the Reichstag, which is like the German equivalent of the Congress. There's no concrete proof of this, but he definitely had Rudolf Hess burn down the Reichstag, like within a few months of him coming to power. And of course they were like, oh, the communists and the Jews did it. Like they'd do stuff like that all the time, and to blame their kind of political enemies. But it does work economically, and so it seems to be the trend for countries to turn to strong leaders like this in times of crisis. This is like where the word tyrant came from. In democratic Greece, in a time of crisis, they could elect to have a tyrant rule until the crisis is over. Of course, the problem is, and this is why the word tyrant became a bad, because it wasn't like originally like a negative term. It was like saying king or it's something like that. But it's like, oh, most of those tyrants don't let go of power once the crisis is over. So like that kind of became the trend historically. And clearly that is the trend in the middle of the 20th century. And so America goes a different direction. It's one more of these factors that makes America increasingly more unique amongst the nations of the world as we move into the 20th century. So Franklin Roosevelt's a very liberal leader, and he okay, so we've talked about wealth a bit tonight. Most of our elected leaders are to some degree wealthy. A lot more than common people that came up, AOC is more rare than, somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, who is very wealthy. Like his family had been living in New York since it was Dutch. They still spoke Dutch. They did it so the servants couldn't understand them. That's like, oh, you're like European snooty class. Like, and I'm in favor of government by the people, like it should be representative. There should be wealthy people in government because there's wealthy people, but like there should be a lot more of average people and middle class people in government. I think government would be a lot better. But particularly in a time like this of both domestic and international crisis, having somebody that comes from money and power like that, they're not afraid of like the big players in the game or the institutions, or like they know how to maneuver around that stuff and deal with it and what to take seriously and not seriously way more than you or me ever will. Even if you became super wealthy tomorrow, you didn't grow up with money. You know what I mean? Like there's a kind of confidence that comes with that he is not shy politically. So he becomes known as the great experimenter. He tries out all kinds of things. He has a ton of failed programs in the New Deal. But then there's a lot of things that come out of it that are, oh, that was pretty remarkable and different and an alternative to kind of the more extreme right-wing versions that are happening in Europe and Japan at the time, and across the Soviet Union. The government grows during this time, and he certainly expands the reach of the federal government, but not the way that like totalitarian or fascist rulers are controlling every element of their governments. So, for instance, like an old age pension in Britain is you turn this old and you'll get this money to live off of because you're there and you're living in Britain and you have residence. That's not the case in America. You get Social Security if you work 40 full-time quarters and pay into it. And the more you pay into it and the longer you work, the more you'll get at the end of it. And it's a handout program. Like it is it is not a handout program the way that people talk about socialism, like true socialism, like an old age pension, right? Like that's like you're going to get it because you qualify just by being here. This is different, right? This is like a government retirement insurance policy that the government forces you to pay into. And it starts during this time when there's no money in there and old people aren't putting money into it because they're just having all the current workers put money in. So that's going to make the payoffs for, the current beneficiaries of Social Security. And this works fine until there's less babies than old people, which Italy is they don't have Social Security this way, but just on other economic levels, like, oh, they're in decline in population. We're not in decline, but the baby boomer generation after World War II is the biggest one, and then they have a lot less kids, and then a bunch of them are still working, like they don't retire, but they are taking Social Security anyways, and it's like, oh, this is putting a strain on the system very much. And let me play just a short minute from his inaugural.
You, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I swear that I am the Constitution of the United States.
My friends,
this is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. In such a spirit on my part and on yours, we face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. Values have shrunk to fantastic levels, taxes have risen, our ability to pay has fallen, government of all kinds is faced by serious curtailment of income, the means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade, the withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side, farmers find no market for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment.
and yet our distress comes from no failure of substance. We are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered because they believed and were not afraid, we have still much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. Primarily.
So, it's a great line. You've got nothing to fear but fear itself, which of course is categorically untrue. We are afraid of clowns. We are afraid of, some of us are afraid of heights, right? Like there's all kinds of fears, but like that's the kind of slogan-y language that is really helpful in becoming president, right? You've got nothing to fear but fear itself. It's like, well, what does that actually mean? Woodrow Wilson, this is a war to end all wars. Is it? Like, but you know, it's a great soundbite, and it's really like, okay. And you can see the maybe the appeal for the nation for someone like him who exudes that kind of confidence and optimism and like take charge nature that was not around the last 12 years for sure, before his presidency. Like government was handoff. And you know, FDR is definitely like in kind of the rankings of presidents. He's always in the top 5, and it's not just because he led the country out of the Depression and to victory in World War II. That's pretty impressive. You know, it's also because he had his finger on the pulse of the people in the country at the time, right? He's like, look, we got to talk truth about what's going on now. But then goes on to paint a totally different picture that is not necessarily truth. It's more like a hope. But that's what the country needed. And that's kind of, I think that's one of those factors that really like distinguishes between like presidential leaders. Like think about JFK, you know, talking about landing people on the moon. We had no confidence that we were going to even get into orbit, right? Like that was crazy lofty. But kind of like him, he came from money and had this like just a swagger about him that you know, Herbert Hoover did not have. That Dwight Eisenhower didn't have. Now, he's a good leader, right? He led the Allied forces in Europe. I mean, he's defeated Hitler. But and he was certainly confident, right? I mean, he's pretty confident as a general, 5-star general, but it's a different kind than the kind you find from somebody like FDR. So literally, right as FDR is getting elected and inaugurated, Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany. And like Germany at the time is a democratic socialist country. They have the equivalent of a Congress, and they don't have like a single executive leader. It's a chancellor and a president. And the president is President von Hindenburg, who's like a military hero, but very old. And so first they burn down the Reichstag and like totally like and then Hindenburg dies, I think, the next year. And so Hitler just assumes the presidency and combines them into one. And you know, he'll pass a bunch of restrictive laws, and then a few years later, he takes direct command over the entire military. So, you know, he consolidates all his own power. And their kind of paths will just go like this. They die within, I think, a few weeks of each other. I think FDR died like a week or two. Actually, I don't know if it's before or after Hitler. I can't remember right now. It was before. I thought so. He knew the war. He knew we won the war. He knew that was over. Like, but it was a matter of like how and when. You know, I think by the time he died, he wasn't worried about Hitler regaining anything. I mean, honestly, by middle of 1944, it was very clear. Like, oh, you guys, it's like people in Germany knew it. The whole atmosphere of Germany and all the other countries actually changed, because by that point it was definitely like this is over. You got no real hope of this, but the country's messed up and frenzied. So you know, like they're in it till the end. So it's just fascinating, like that, you know, how different those two leaders are, and what different directions they took these two countries in. Yeah, like here, let's. like Hitler's kind of main thing that he started inaugurating every year was this massive Nazi rally in Nuremberg, where they built a huge stadium. And I mean, you're talking like a few 100,000 people at the rally. It's to that point, at least, had to be one of the biggest gatherings in human history. Um, at least in like a organized way like this. Because I mean, a few decades earlier, loudspeakers don't exist, right? We don't think of having a big rally with somebody speaking over a PA as anything kind of revolutionary, but it was then, and kind of like with radio and media, and he utilized these to great effect, and had a pretty good marketing team. They're very good at presenting kind of this polished picture of German excellence and kind of the ideals of the country. Yeah. You know who made them? Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss made all of the Nazi uniforms. I mean, think about that next time you go shopping. Kruger, they did a ton of stuff for the Nazis and made weapons and stuff like that. Volkswagen was Hitler's idea. It literally means people's car in German. And I mean, it's what it was. It's like super cheap, very efficient car that is, it's kind of like Germany's answer to the Model T. It's like, oh, this will make owning automobile, because like in 1933, there were not a lot of Germans with cars. They didn't have tons of paved roads everywhere. He created the Autobahn, which definitely helped with German like transportation and industry and the economy. But he did it for this, so you can roll tanks across the country quickly. Because if railroads get blown up, it takes a minute to get those things patched back up. But having kind of well-paved roads that you can go fast through without stopping, you're not stopping in towns. It's very essential for modern warfare. And he also figured like, hey, when we get into the war, I mean, he was always planning on there being a war. He said, we got to avoid what happened in the first war, where we get split and we're fighting two fronts war. And one of the ways to avoid doing that is to be able to move troops and transportation and all that stuff across the country very quickly. So there was years and years and years of planning going into the launch of the war, and all these incremental steps along the way, which is, I cut so much out of the World War II chapter because I trying to just write the things that I'm like, oh, this is important and this is important. It was like 80,000 words long. I'm like, okay, that is definitely too long for a survey level college textbook. Like, so I trimmed a lot, but there's still a lot in there, because I feel like, especially with things like Hitler's rise to power or the Holocaust, it's good. It's important for us to understand, like, oh, these happen slowly with these incremental steps, because that's the way it's going to happen the next time it happens, right? Like it's going to be the same, not the exact same things, but we'll see the same things played out. Taking a crisis to seize more control or emergency power of something, creating a crisis to do that. Then it not only makes sense of like, oh, okay, oh, I see how Hitler got to where he was, because people were looking for a right-wing kind of like extreme answer to everything that was going on in 1933 when he got elected, but they weren't all the Nazi psychopaths that they turned into by 1945, right? Like the country, not everybody in the country, there was resistance in Germany, right? But like there was maybe like 30% of the country that was full blown like bought in, and another solid 30 or 40% of the country that did the kind of head in the sand, like we'll just be good Germans and wave the flag, and we're not Jewish or communists, so what do we care, right? Like we're good German people, so this is all good changes for us. So that like it takes years to get the country into that spot. They're not all there instantly. He wasn't that charismatic or convincing. It's like a slow process to convert an entire country over to fanaticism. And also that's the exact same with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. This was not something that was created in the 30s. It was something that Hitler tapped into because it was very, very, very prevalent in everywhere in Europe, absolutely everywhere. And it's not that all Europeans were anti-Semitic, but it was that European culture was anti-Semitic. Like so many literary characters or like images of witches, they're all like Jewish stereotype mimics. They're like mockeries of Jewish people and Jewish culture. That is, we have that in America. There, because we're from a European culture. That's kind of our baseline culture that holds in a bunch of other cultures as well. But certainly, all of the kind of anti-Semitic tropes that those transferred over to America. I think we're just less focused on anti-Semitism because we have even larger, more encompassing and wider sweeping racial problems. Like it's like, oh, we've got anti-Semitism plus all the other stuff, where that's like people aren't really like anti-Black people in Germany because there aren't any, unless you're going to jazz clubs, right? That's where you might find some people there, maybe in Berlin or London, really big international cities, but certainly not regular German towns or villages. Everybody's going to be ethnically the same, except for Jewish people. So he's tapping into that and slowly expands on that. It's not like he's like, we're rounding up all the Jews on day one. He didn't, I don't even think he passed anti-Semitic laws until the next year. And even then it was like just restrictive laws, and then a little bit more restriction the next night, and then some outright bans on Jews and communists and other groups from certain professions. And then it was, okay, we're going to have a sanctioned pogrom against Jewish people. This is like Crystal Night, when they say, hey, this is the night, have at it. You guys can go like vandalize and burn down Jewish stores and, attack Jewish people. And Germany did that. And so it's just like one more step deeper into the thing where, and this is not to justify anything, but there's going to be people in German towns and villages that are like, yeah, let's go burn down that shop. That if you were like, hey, let's round all of them up and their children and everybody and like gas them and burn them all to death and exterminate them, they might be like, well, that is might be too much, right? Like there are a lot of racist people in America. There's a smaller percentage of them that are like, let's lynch somebody. You know what I mean? Like but that's the deal though. You get these restrictive laws and then relocating people, and then they just disappear and don't ask questions and don't talk about it. And hey, all these homes opened up and my son just got married and he's getting one, and hey, I got this painting from this house, and like this is working out good for us. Let's just not think about it too long because we know what that probably entails and means. I know it's 7:30. I just want to go a little bit more, and then we'll break for the night. Instead of taking a break right now. Let's see. This becomes a rather remarkable moment. In 1936,
After the fanfares of the Olympic opening,
Germany was slated to host the Olympics in 1936, but there's significant like international outcry about doing anything there because there's clearly like human rights violations going on. It wasn't like people didn't know that they weren't like targeting Jews and, you know, locking people up in detention centers and work camps and stuff like that. Like enough people knew that there was so much scrutiny put on the Olympics that this became a moment for Hitler to prove to the world that Germany's just fine and we're okay. And look, let's have some Jewish people around during the Olympics. We'll take down all the anti, Jewish signs and not make people wear the Stars of David and all of that. And they did that, and they had all their cameramen there and clipped footage to just make it look like Disney World. And this reassured lots of people because by 1936, like Hitler hadn't gone, there's a lot of things he hadn't crossed yet. There's a lot of lines he hadn't crossed by here. So people had questions. I think the international community, there were a lot of concerns. And this was like his ultimate propaganda piece to say like, yeah, no, we're fine. Look, we just want to make a Germany for Germans. Like, what's wrong with that, right? And Jesse Owens is an American track star. He's going to come and compete in the Olympics. And obviously, in America, there is a lot of racial tension and there's segregation, and he would not be allowed to compete in some states against white men. And Germany, there's clearly a lot of racial issues and tensions there as well. But, he's not really a threat to their system. He is here. Like, it's a threat to this American, subtext of white superiority. He's clearly the best athlete at in his meets.
Yeah. Nazis, they wanted to prove that the Aryan race was superior, so they let them.
Mm-hmm.
Also, because Hitler was not Aryan and he was a Jew.
There is some evidence that his biological father was Jewish, but a lot of his early history is obscured. He did that on purpose. He had records destroyed and things burned down, and like you got to wonder why somebody who's such a megalomaniac and obsessed with themselves wouldn't want their past preserved in history. But questions for the subreddit conspiracy boards. Yeah, here we'll watch him compete.
in comes the most amazing performance by America's black streak Jesse Owens in the 100 meters. The world's most superb runner makes the others look as if they're walking, as he wins the final and equals the world's record time. This and his later victory in the long jump may well be the athletic performances of the century. And now the final struggle is on in the women's javelin throwing. And here's little Sadako Yamamoto of Japan, with a name that spells trouble for commentators and
There's a really good movie called Race that came out a few years ago that is about him and this journey and trip. And Jason Sudeikis plays the coach. It was good. It was a good movie. It's on your list for like, some options for like historical films for your project, which probably next week we'll start talking about that. Maybe we'll spend the first hour of class or so kind of spitballing about that and explaining that and looking at how to make a good paper project in that. Yeah, some of these, these are just kind of interesting things that you can look at on your own if you're interested. It's like the short story behind how the VW Beetle got built. Nescafe was made during this time for soldiers on the battlefield. The Hindenburg explodes. um, the Spanish Civil War is another one of those examples of a turn towards fascism, totalitarianism, where the government is split. They're literally devolve into fighting, and Franco will take power, and he becomes the dictator. I think he's remains dictator until like the early 70s, or late 60s. They wind up staying neutral during the war, kind of because when it begins, they're in their own turmoil. But they also, this kind of becomes a testing ground for the war that's going to come. A bunch of Americans will come over and volunteer, as well as other people from other, nations, European and North American nations, to fight on the side of the Republicans, the more liberal government and their side. And the Germans will come in and fight on the side of Franco and the conservatives. Particularly, they want to test some of their new weapons, and they want to test out their Air Force that they've been building in secret and getting around rules by training all their pilots by starting off on like gliders. So they're secretly building up their army and their weapons and their Air Force, which remember was like forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. So this is like a direct, violation of that. And so they go in and they create they're committing war crimes during this war as well. So it's like if everybody was paying a little bit more attention, I feel that they possibly could have stopped Hitler and everything that's going on beforehand, but unfortunately, they don't. In 1939, there's going to be a kind of an emergency conference held because Hitler, he keeps violating all the conditions of the treaty. So I think in 1937, he peacefully invades Austria. Now, they had sent Nazis in for months in advance to like create militia groups and like stir up trouble and dissension amongst the government, and to send messages to like some of the government's top leaders, like join us or die. And so a bunch of Austrians fled the country when Hitler came to power, including a lot of politicians. That's The Sound of Music, right? That's, if you've ever watched that, that's the story of the von Trapp family that were fleeing the Nazis coming. But they march in and without firing a shot, merge Austria in. That's a big violation. They're building their army. They reoccupy the Rhineland. And then in 1938, they invade the Sudetenland, which is the land. Actually, I think they did that the year before. It's like Germany and Czechoslovakia border each other. And so the whole like border section, there's a lot of ethnically German people that live there. And they say, we just want to like take this land so that all German people in Europe can live in Germany. And they say, okay, but don't take any more. He says, I promise. And then he invades Czechoslovakia and takes over the whole country outright. So this is Neville Chamberlain returning from this Munich conference where he goes amongst with some other leaders to sign this kind of agreement that says, okay, we're going to let you have Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, the only country that paid off its World War I debts. Like the League of Nations is just like, all right. Like they're a member of the League of Nations. And they're like, what are you going to do? Shucks. And so, Neville Chamberlain's, he comes back and he greets the country and he assures them that he's secured peace in our time. And so, you know, that's like a phrase that's still used in culture. I think that it, you know, it usually, when somebody says that, it means like, oh, I went and accomplished nothing, or, you know, I made an agreement that I thought was good, but it's not like actually going to pan out, because he says, I've assured peace in our time, which, I mean, this is only 20 years after World War I has ended. So this is very fresh on people. Everybody living that's over the age of 25 remembers the war. So they're very nervous to get in any kind of big engagement with any country in Europe or anywhere else for that matter. So they think appeasing Hitler, they can avoid war. But of course, what they don't realize is they make him just stronger and more powerful, and they reveal their weakness and their impotence to stop anything. And so he moves forward with preparations to invade Poland. And he knows that invading Poland will for sure trigger the Soviet Union to be like, nope, we're going to go fight against you, because they are terrified of the Nazis. Because the Nazis are like very publicly like, we want to eradicate you from the face of the earth, and we think you're the scourge of humanity. We kill every last one of you when we get the chance. So Stalin is reaching out for allies during 1937 and 38, because he sees what's happening with Hitler. He's like, he's moving east. He's building up the army. And he goes to France and Britain and America, and like, we all tell him to shove it up his, you know, commie butt. And like, we're like, honestly, most of the country's leadership of all of those nations was like, but Nazis are better than communists, right? Like that, we fear communism. Communism will uproot our society, and for all the rich people making the decisions, it will take our money and our wealth away and redistribute it to people. Like this is the rich's greatest fear, right? It's not death, and it's not even like a crazy right-wing government. It's a crazy left-wing government. I fear it, because that's like the end of them and their society. And mind you, right, like, we're not into like crimes against humanity and just the atrocities that will unfold with the Nazis and the extreme cruelty. At least, you know, people are not eyes wide open to it yet. So, you know, America, England, they're like, well, that might work out. You guys might kill each other off. That'd be great. And so that's what everybody's kind of planning on happening. I think maybe there's even an that's in the back of the mind with the Munich agreement. But Stalin shocks the world by announcing a it's not a treaty. It's a I can't remember what it is. It's an agreement, basically, like, hey, we've got a mutual, you know, like, ceasefire, we're not going to war with each other agreement. He makes this deal with Hitler. Hitler sends his foreign minister to Moscow, and they sign the deal, they secure the deal, and the deal is like, we're not going to attack each other, and we're both going to invade Poland, and you take half, I'll take half, and that'll be our buffer state between our countries. And, you know, like, it didn't work out super well for the Soviet Union. Well, it definitely didn't work out for the Polish people, but it didn't work out for the Soviet Union very well. And it shocked the world when this happened, and they invade Poland, and it's a very, very quick invasion. Here, we'll watch this. This is short.
Through October 6th, 1939, World War II. The German invasion of Poland began on September 1st, 1939, and besides Germany and Poland, brought the United Kingdom and France into the war. German preparations for the invasion started months before the attack and included not only military preparations, but also aggressive propaganda and similar actions to justify German aggression against Poland. Operation Himmler, also known as the Operation Canned Goods, was a false flag operation conducted in order to make the appearance of Polish aggression towards Germany. The most famous action of the operation was the Gleifitz incident. On August 31, 1939, the Germans staged an attack on a radio station in Gleifitz, making it look as it was attacked by Poles, and broadcasted a false call to Poles in Germany to rise against Hitler. Along with other similar staged incidents, the Germans used this event as an excuse to attack Poland. Contrary to the Germans, who had already disposed their units along the border with Poland before the attack, the Poles had delayed their mobilization of their troops as they were pressured by their British and French allies not to do it. They believed that mobilization would only provoke Hitler and give him a reason to violate peace on the European continent. For that reason, the Polish forces didn't gather all their troops in time by September 1st, when the Germans attacked them. Fall Weiss, or Case White, was the German plan to invade Poland from three directions: through the north from Prussia and northeastern Germany, a main attack through the western border of Poland from East Germany, and through the south from the border of the puppet state of Slovakia. Two army groups, north and south, were ordered to encircle the Polish troops and to meet near Warsaw. For the invasion, the German forces engaged 2/3 of their infantry, almost all panzer units, and more than 2,000 planes, leaving the rest of its units on Germany's western border in case of a French attack. Since the Germans anticipated that the British and French would enter the war once Poland was attacked, they planned to finish the invasion quickly before the French and British troops would have time to mobilize. The invasion began in the early hours of September 1st, with the guns of a German battleship which was visiting the Polish port of Danzig opening fire. The Polish defense, known as Plan West, anticipated the protection of the entire border with Germany and Slovakia, since this region was the industrial heart of the country. This proved to be a big mistake, since most of the units couldn't evade the quick maneuvers of German panzer troops, leading them to become surrounded. The first days of the invasion saw intense German attacks from both land and air. The Luftwaffe gained air superiority immediately, even though the Polish pilots put up a brave resistance. Attacks made by German panzer troops were so intense that Polish units were forced to retreat from their defensive positions after the first days of combat. France and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but without any true support. The German forces used their tactic of blitzkrieg, a swift, combined arms attack that overwhelmed the enemy and surrounded them. German technological and numerical superiority proved to be a decisive feature of the campaign that Poland just couldn't oppose. However, the Polish army did try to counterattack the German forces at the Battle of Zura near Warsaw. During the 10 days of the battle from September 9th to September 18th, the Polish forces were destroyed by the attacks from the Luftwaffe and panzer units. In the 2 weeks of the invasion, the whole of western Poland was conquered. Aware that they couldn't establish any kind of tactical advantage, Polish command decided to retreat its troops to the southeastern part of the country, where there was a hilly landscape suitable for organizing a proper resistance. The vicinity of the Romanian border also gave the opportunity to withdraw from the country. The Polish plan was to establish a solid defense in order to prolong the invasion for a French and British response on the west. However, the British and French support would never come. The French only engaged in a small, limited skirmish in the Saarland with no effect. The Polish plans proved futile when on September 17th the Soviet Union suddenly violated the non-aggression pact it had with Poland and attacked it with a pretext to protect the Belarusian and Ukrainian population. The Soviet invasion of Poland was prearranged with Germany on August 23, 1939, with the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact. This pact not only anticipated friendly behavior between the two countries, but also a joint invasion of Poland and its division afterwards. When 800,000 Red Army soldiers entered Poland, the Polish forces knew that it couldn't oppose the enemies on two fronts. Even though the Poles continued to resist the German forces, like in the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski, all efforts were futile. Polish units were being surrounded everywhere, and such was the case with Polish cities. The capital of Poland, Warsaw, surrendered on September 27th after 16 days of struggle. The last Polish unit surrendered on October 6th after the Battle of Koch. Facing more powerful and numerous enemies on two fronts and abandoned by its allies, Poland suffered defeat. After it had been defeated, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided its territory, thus ending the Second Republic of Poland. For the German forces, the Polish campaign taught them valuable lessons for future operations that led to the conquest of Europe. Even though defeated on the battlefield, what was left of the Polish military continued to fight with the British forces until the end of the war. Subscribe and click the notification bell for more history videos.
You know, if we're asking when does World War II start, a lot of people say September 1st, 1939. But, you know, we can see out of just some of the events I just talked about, the war started earlier than that, for sure. I mean, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, that kind of seems like the beginning of the war. They're not as big of a country as Poland, but still something. Or the joining of Austria, or, you know, that's in Europe, right? In Asia, the Japanese do something similar in 1932. It's called the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where they do a false flag attack on themselves and say, oh, look, the Chinese did this, and so we're going to invade them and take over this part and turn it into a Japanese puppet state in northern China, which is exactly what they do. It was all their plan to do it. They weren't inevitable events. They planned for this to happen. They're an expansionist government, same way Germany is. They're like, our goal is to grow our empire, our land empire, and to dominate the lesser peoples around us. You know, so for the Japanese, that was like the Koreans and the Chinese and maybe the Philippines, which they go and invade and take over and kick the Americans out of, and pretty much all of you know, Eastern and Southeast Asia. Their goal, you know, they only started modernizing really in 1869. It's been a closed society until then, and the world was shocked at how quickly they modernized and turned into a modern naval empire. And they did it literally by just copying Britain. They're like, Britain's about the same size as us. They're an island nation. They dominate the world. Like, let's be the Britain of Asia. And so that's their playbook. And, you know, that was a huge significant move towards war and what the war in the East is going to look like and involve. So, you know, why not say start there, right? But, hey, we could go all the way back and say maybe the war started really when Hitler tried to overthrow the government in 1922. And then that's really like pretty close to the end of World War I. It didn't really ever stop, right? Because a bunch of the countries that were involved in the treaty, I mean, especially Austria and Germany, they didn't think the treaty was legitimate, right? They said, we've got an armistice, we're laying down arms, to talk about peace terms. And then it kind of fell apart for them. And they got what they perceived as an illegitimate, you know, terms of peace. And people like Hitler and, you know, a lot of other folks, the war never ended for them. It was like, nope, we're going to keep going and we're going to course correct and win this and overturn the humiliation of this. And, you know, if you could even go back before 1914, like Japan, I think they invade and take over Korea in 1904, right? Like that's certainly, for the Koreans, that's the beginning of the war. You know, I think maybe a date like 1939 is a decent candidate because it's not necessarily the beginning of the war. It's kind of the point of no return for the war, though. It's like, oh crap, all the countries that they were like, we'll do anything to avoid going to war and fighting again, realize, oh, this is inevitable. Oh, they're gonna drive this war, and if we don't get moving, we're gonna get wiped out. And France gets wiped out. I mean, they get invaded and taken over almost as quickly as Poland does. It's shocking. I mean, Poland was shocking. Hitler will be in Paris in less than a year after Poland, and a few different moves, and he would have wiped out the bulk of the British army as well. If, you know, he would have pressed in on Dunkirk. Lucky those are like consequential turning points and things like the engagement of the war, because if they would have blasted everybody to smithereens, they might have been able to do a sea invasion of Britain. I mean, they had plans for it, but the tides turned literally the other way, and most of the British and French troops that are trapped there get evacuated in a really miraculous event. So yeah, when does the war begin? Hard to say. Certainly by September 1st, though, it's on. It's like that's it. And kind of like the initial earlier events, and then the finality of kind of like this crossing line. For the war in Europe, at least, it is over by the summer of 1944, because Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the person that he made a non-aggression pact with, he was aggressive towards them. It fails, and the Soviet Union starts destroying the Nazi army. And so it's very clear to people with kind of that scope of what's happening. Oh, the tides turned. You guys can't win this war. The best you could hope for is to get back across your border and end war and get peace with the other countries you're at. But nobody was going to go to peace with the Nazis. They're like, you can't let this guy and this regime and this whole system keep going. So, and yeah, by May of the next year, it will definitely definitively be over in Europe, but not over in Asia, right? The Japanese are still fighting and fighting strong and fiercely, and invading Japan is a lot harder than invading Germany. Like, it's hard to invade really well defended, protected islands, like it always has been. That's the benefit of being an island. It's harder for people to roll up on you with a bunch of equipment, even in modern day times. And so the question of when that's going to end is very much one that's concerning certainly Americans, but kind of everybody involved. And that's a huge factor in deploying the bomb, is to put a definitive end on it and do it much sooner than later. But that is something for a different time. We'll talk about that kind of, well, next week we'll get kind of a little bit more into the ebb and flow of the war and those years, and then really take a good look at the kind of aftermath, not only of the realization of the Holocaust and just kind of humanity trying to wrap our collective mind around something like that, and the revelations and the evidence that's coming out, but then also humanity trying to wrap our minds around the insanity of atomic fission. Like, that's just, and then the rebuilding process of the world after it's been ripped to total shreds. So, the United Nations and UNESCO and the World Bank and all of those things that come out that are our current world, like our governing institutions internationally, the things that make our economy not just collapse, are from 1945. Like, that we are in that world. So before the war, it's a different system running things, but especially for America, coming out of the New Deal nationally and then out of the war internationally, it's like, okay, those kind of systems are still things we have to place. So. All right. Well, I kept you for 2 hours straight. It's probably long enough. Any questions or thoughts before we go? All right, I'll cut you guys out and see you next week. I'll send out something or post something on Canvas about Monday's discussion if anybody's interested.